Okay, so this was an awesome article posted last week by Alexis Royalko. It was shared by Aleda Solis, where Alexis basically argued that ChatGPT search is using the Google index more heavily than it ever has before, possibly even replacing the Bing index with the Google index. So I thought this was fascinating, albeit a pretty big claim. I did share in the post I shared that I said, hey, I'm seeing evidence too that it looks like ChatGPT is using more of Google's index. So I'm going to go through some of Alexis's hypotheses and kind of share where I think there's overlap and maybe where there's not overlap in terms of whether or not ChatGPT is using the Google search results or not. So the first big claim he made was said, hey, there's a lot of overlap between the ChatGPT search results and the Google search results. And overall, I would agree, right? So I searched some of the same queries that he did. Here I searched for best beginner tennis rackets. I then actually used ChatGPT Path Extractor to say like, hey, which queries is ChatGPT searching? So here it searched for best beginner tennis rackets 2025. I did a Google search for that and a Bing search. Even before searching, you can just kind of like tell this result looks more like kind of traditional Google search results. Like here is the Reddit thread, here's tennisnerd.net. Right here in the more section, there's YouTube videos, more Reddit threads, some actual forum results from tennis specific forums. That just looks like a Google result, and when you actually look at the Google results, it looks very similar. So here I search for that query. We see a lot of overlap. Here's the discussions and forums. A Reddit thread repeated twice, that same Talk Tennis forum article. We're seeing Tennis Nerd here, so a ton of overlap, right? When we look at Bing, there is still some overlap, just not quite as much, right? So I did that search in Bing. Here you can actually see the the tennis tribe result. That's the #1 cited article. But other than that, there's not a ton of overlap. No YouTube videos, Reddit threads. We know those are inherently Google features. And when I test this around other queries, I see a lot of the same things. So that seems to track. It seems to be a ton of overlap with the Google search results. As well, in Alexis's article, he also kind of talked about JavaScript rendering. He talked about how Google could potentially or ChatGPT could essentially use Google's index as a workaround for its inability to navigate JavaScript. So use an example on the Uniqlo site where he's like, hey, Uniqlo just redesigned their site. If you go to a sample product page, this is what that product page looks like. It looks blank, but hey, you can actually if you ask ChatGPT search, it will actually find the content of an individual product page for you. So I wanted to test that as well. The tests on my end were a little bit less conclusive. So like here, I went in and said, hey, what's on this page? And I used a page that I knew was just JavaScript rendered. And surprisingly, ChatGPT was able to surface it. It actually came up and said, hey, here's all the information. But then when I drove down to the sources a little bit, it didn't use just that page. It kind of like looks like it stitched it together. So if I look and see here, I went into one of the articles or one of the product pages. It actually didn't use the exact URL that I used. I used a URL in the French domain and it actually used a URL in the English, US domain. So I think it was kind of a workaround where it said, and it kind of used a bunch of different articles here to kind of like stitch together what the results were. So I think it kind of worked around it, but it was able to find articles that weren't dependent on JavaScript. And then I went and said, hey, can you just read that page? Just read the page in the French directory. And then it came back and said it couldn't. So I don't think that ChatGPT has solved its JavaScript issues through Google's index. I still think it does not have the ability to do that. But that was just from my testing. The final part of this test was that he went in and said one of the most compelling pieces of evidence that is when you look at URLs in ChatGPT search, they use that SRS, this kind of ID parameter, right? That's very common with Google. And this is a pretty compelling piece of evidence because this is only from Google search. We know that Google has recently indexed a lot of commerce results with this parameter in it. And then when we take a look, and I can go back to that first query, we see a lot of results with that parameter in it. So here I'll go in the Tennis Warehouse article here. And right here I can see if I go here, it has that SSRID parameter right in the result here, right? This is something that's very consistent with Google, and it probably only will be pulling from Google search. And if you search in Bing's index here, I did a site search against that same thread, right? So here at Tennis Warehouse and that Learning Center. And then if I go to different individual articles, there is no parameter attached to the end of it, right? You can go down across these different articles, and you will not see that parameter found. So that's a pretty compelling piece of evidence that they are at least somewhat using Google's index because that parameter is strictly specific to Google. So right now, if I had to advise clients, I would say that yes, ChatGPT search is using Google search more heavily than it ever has. It might even be the dominant search engine. I still think that they're stitching in some Bing results. I think they're pulling in from both. But I think there's a ton of compelling evidence to say that ChatGPT search is using Google as its primary index source. So hopefully that helps and provides some database kind of analysis on which index engine ChatGPT search is actually using.